advantages over the man who was shut up inside the dark walls of a prison. Therefore, you will find it much easier to play at this game of enthusiasm than he did. Keep up this game of enthusiasm for 1 month, no matter what you may see others doing. Say nothing to anyone as to why you are doing this. You'll get a lot of fun out of this game. You will notice that people will begin to show more interest in you. You will notice that your employer will begin to watch you. But you must keep your own counsel and go right ahead with your game. You must keep the fact in mind that you are on the road to success, and the signboards on the road told you to play at the game of enthusiasm for 1 whole month. You may not know why you are instructed to play at this game of enthusiasm, but you will see long before the end of the month that it paid to follow instructions. 2 hobos met in a boxcar one dark and rainy night. One of them had been a salesman whose hours were from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., and the other one didn't have any money either. They started to talk about themselves. One of them said to the other, "I used to work for a house that wanted me to put in regular hours. They talked a lot about this enthusiasm bunk, but it never made much of a hit with me. I told them I would work my way or not at all. They didn't like my way, so I put on my hat and walked out." The other hobo had been a smart fellow in his time, but whiskey and gambling had ruined him. He listened to his pal for a few minutes, then asked this question. "How is it, Bill, that a fellow who knows as much as you do about running his employer's business is riding in a boxcar instead of a Pullman coach?" That question was a stunner. Haven't you noticed among the people you have met that the fellow who is a failure usually criticizes the fellow who is succeeding? You'll notice that successful people are too busy succeeding to waste any of their time in criticizing their country, their government, their fellow workers, or their employer. You'll notice that people who are succeeding are enthusiastic over their work, and you never hear them explaining how they lost their jobs. You will also notice that people who mix enthusiasm with their work are always in the best jobs and get the highest pay. You will also notice that the fellow who shows no enthusiasm over anything and is always complaining about his job being too hard and his pay too small is the first one to be let out when work is slack. Chapter 6. Action. The 6th billboard on the road to success is action. In size, a man is about 100 million times larger than a bee. But in intelligence, the bee is about 100 million times larger than the man. The man gazes proudly at his handiwork, the great skyscrapers which blend into distance, and says to himself, "See what a wonderful being I am. See what great buildings I have constructed. See what evolution has done for the human race. See the wealth I have created." The intelligent little bee, standing guard at the entrance to its hive, hears the man boasting and replies, "Yes, it is true, you have made wonderful changes on the earth's surface. You have turned dirt into skyscrapers. You have built powerful locomotives. You have mastered the air, and you have measured the distance to the stars. But one thing you have not done, in spite of all your achievement, is to discover the possibilities within that head of yours. Another thing you have not discovered is the community spirit. You have yet to find out that there is something in the world to work for which is greater than your individual welfare. You work for the selfish end of taking away from your fellow workers that which they have acquired. You have not yet discovered the hive spirit, which we little bees observe. We store honey for the good of the hive, while you store up money with which to strangle your fellow worker and control him for your individual gain. What a wonderful little insect. What a wonderful lesson he can teach us if we will only watch him, analyze his habits, and think. The bee is the only living thing on earth that can control and determine sex before birth. Man, in all of his wisdom, with all of his advancement, with all of his knowledge of biology and physiology, can neither predetermine nor control sex. The little honeybee can control sex. Go out and buy a book on bees and study up on them. Go out to the hive, lie down in front of it, and watch the bee at his work. He is an interesting little insect, from which you can learn much that will be of value to you. There are 3 kinds of bees in every hive. One is the queen, which is the mother or female bee. She lays the eggs and keeps the race alive. That is her sole duty. Then there is the drone or the male bee. His sole function is to fertilize the eggs which the female lays. Then there are the workers, those little intelligent fellows who gather the honey from the flowers and store it up for the use of the whole hive. They are neither male nor female. There is only one female or queen bee in each hive. If a boy throws a rock into the hive and kills the queen, or if she dies from any other cause, the other bees, through a process known only to the bee, immediately fertilize an egg that will hatch out another queen bee in a very short time. After the male bee has performed the function for which nature created him, the workers jump on him and sting him to death. There is a decree in beedom that all who do not work must get out. Not a bad idea. You'll notice that most of the bees in every hive are workers. This is no mere accident upon the part of nature. She has provided the bees with a method of producing drones, females, and workers in whatever proportion they may determine. But the greatest lesson that man can learn from the bee is that of unselfishness. Bees work with the community spirit. They recognize something higher than the individual himself. They work for their fellow bees, not against them. They store up honey in a common storehouse from which the whole hive may eat. Imagine selfish, stingy, conceited man doing likewise. Imagine man sharing the product of his labors with his fellow men, unless by doing so he gets more than he gives. Man has advanced far beyond the bee in some respects. But may it not be possible that he kicked out of the harness and strayed away from nature's plans when he discarded the community spirit and started in to defeat and defraud his fellow workers out of that which they have accumulated? We don't profess to know what are nature's plans, but we strongly suspect that before man can enjoy the blessings which are here and available for him, he must overcome the spirit of greed, the tendency to get without giving, and come back to the bee habit of working for the hive. This writer knows beyond the question of doubt that the only real happiness which he enjoys is that which comes from serving his fellow men, and we doubt not that many another has discovered this same truth. After you have looked everywhere else for the cause of your unhappiness, turn the spotlight on your own heart. Examine the thoughts in which you have been indulging, and you may find it. The Golden Rule lays down a principle which is more than a mere preachment. It bids you go out and get whatever you wish by first giving. We don't know whether man got the concept laid down in the Golden Rule from the busy little bee, or whether the bee got the idea for his hive spirit from the Golden Rule. But we do know that the law underlying the Golden Rule philosophy is as immutable as the law of gravitation, which keeps the planets of the universe in their places. And whether a man is conscious of this fact or not, his acts toward his fellow men are coming back to him greatly multiplied. You are constantly attracting to you men and forces which exactly harmonize with your own thoughts and deeds. There is no escape from this. It is in accordance with the law of the universe. In all this strife, in all this chaotic turmoil which is going on between so-called capital and labor, we see a perfect antithesis of the hive spirit. What a profitable lesson both sides could learn from the humble little honeybee. We repeat that we believe the only real success comes from useful service, service which helps others attain monetary success and happiness. Anything short of this sort of service is not success, but failure. We believe the human race must develop the hive spirit before it can advance higher. On every hand, we see the futility of trying to get without giving. Before we have anything to give, we must prepare through practice and labor. We must develop the community spirit. Our point is more clearly stated in the words of George Harrison Phelps in his recent little book titled Go. This story centers on Ben-Hur and his chariot race. The great race of the day is almost ended. The charioteers are nearing the last turn to finish in front of the royal stand. Everyone leans forward. There is no sound throughout the vast Colosseum save the rush of the flying horses, the thunder of the chariots, the cries of the charioteers. The speed is terrific. Ben-Hur is driving in second place. They approach the last corner. The leaders pitch forward. Driver and chariot and horses all roll in front of Ben-Hur. Like a flash, he takes a double hold on the reins and, fairly lifting the horses, drives them over the prostrate bodies in his path. As he swings into the stretch, Artemidora cries to him from the royal box, "Those arms! Where did you get those arms?" He shouts in answer, "At the galley's oar! At the galley's oar!" In the hold of a trireme, Ben-Hur got those mighty arms that carried him to victory. For years he had slaved at a great oar among the 100 other slaves, half naked and sweating, the lash at his back. "Do the thing, and you shall have power," said Emerson. After Ben-Hur's years of Herculean toil, it was an easy task to lift the horses over the wrecked chariot and drive them to the front. All great things are accomplished easily. It is the years, the hours, the moments of preparation that count. Thomas Edison was not 20 minutes proving the value of the incandescent light. He spent a lifetime seeking the best filament. Abraham Lincoln wrote the greatest speech ever made in the English language, the Gettysburg Address, on the back of an envelope, an hour before he delivered it. Yet the deep understanding, the rugged spirit, the infinite compassion, the whole life of Lincoln thrills in every word. Work, constantly, patiently, every day, striving toward the highest and the best. The moments of supreme action will come to you as they have come to all men we call great. The way of success is the way of struggle. Strive for perfection in the little things you do, and when the great moment comes, you will be ready. You get your strength in the sweat of your body, in the tumult of your mind, and the aspiration of your soul. To win the race, you must first be a slave at the galley's oar. And before you start to run the race which is going to mean success or failure to you, there is a great lesson which you can learn from the little honeybee, that of persistency. It matters not how many times man robs the storehouse of the bee. It will begin all over and replenish its supply of honey. No bee was ever known to wail or complain that someone had stolen the fruits of its labor. How unlike man the bee is in this respect. No bee ever quit trying as long as it was able to gather honey. All down the road of life you will meet obstacles, many of them. Time after time, failure will stare you in the face. But just remember this, that there is a great lesson in every obstacle you master and in every failure which you overcome. It is a part of nature's plan to place obstacles in your way. Every time you master one of these, you become stronger and better prepared for the next one. Obstacles are nothing more or less than necessary hurdles which train you and make you fit for the great race of life. If you begin the new year with a firm resolution to perform more work and better work than you are paid to perform, you are apt to make this your most prosperous year. Don't waste any time pitying the man who has met with many reverses and overcome numberless obstacles. He will be able to take care of himself. But if you have sympathy that you wish to squander, give it to the man who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth and who has never known what it is to go hungry, and who has never found it necessary to permit any desire to go unsatisfied. He is the fellow who really needs your sympathy. The others will know how to take care of themselves because they have served their apprenticeship at the galley's oar. Any fool can quit the job when things go wrong, but the man who has the right sort of stuff in him masters the obstacles that made him want to quit and when he has done this, he no longer wants to quit. Chapter 7. Self-Control. A personal inventory of my 36 years of experience. In this editorial, Mr. Hill enumerates what he believes to be the greatest lessons he has learned from early childhood up to the present. I have often heard the expression, "If I had my life to live over, I would live it differently." Personally, I could not truthfully say that I would change anything that has happened in my life if I were living it over. Not that I have made no mistakes, for indeed it seems to me that I have made more mistakes than the average man makes. But out of these mistakes has come an awakening which has brought me real happiness and abundant opportunity to help others find this much sought state of mind. Every year I live, I am more convinced that the waste of life lies in the love we have not given, the powers we have not used, the selfish prudence that will risk nothing, and which, shirking pain, misses happiness as well. I am convinced, beyond room for doubt, that there is a great lesson in every failure, and that so-called failure is absolutely necessary before worthwhile success can be attained. I am not convinced that a part of nature's plan is to throw obstacles in a man's pathway, and that the greatest part of one's education comes not from books or teachers, but from constantly striving to overcome these obstacles. I believe that nature lays down obstacles in a man's pathway, just as the trainer lays down rails and hurdles for a horse to jump over while being trained to pace. Today is my birthday. I shall celebrate it by doing my best to set down for the readers of the little brown-covered messenger some of the lessons which my failures have taught me. Let us begin with my favorite hobby, namely my belief that the only real happiness anyone ever experiences comes from helping others to find happiness. It may be a mere coincidence that practically 25 of my 36 years were very unhappy years, and that I began to find happiness the very day I commenced helping others find it. But I don't believe so. I believe this is more than a coincidence. I believe that it is in strict accordance with the law of the universe. My experience has taught me that a man can no more sow a crop of grief and expect to reap a harvest of happiness than one could sow thistles and expect to reap a crop of wheat. Through many years of careful study and analysis, I have learned conclusively that that which a man gives comes back to him increased many times, even down to the finest detail, whether a mere thought or an overt act. From a material economic standpoint, one of the greatest truths I have learned is that it pays handsomely to render more service and better service than one is paid to render. For just as surely as this is done, it is but a question of time until one is paid for more than he actually does. This one practice of throwing one's heart into every task, regardless of the remuneration, will go further toward the achievement of material, monetary success than any other one thing that I could mention. But this is hardly of less importance than the habit of forgiving and forgetting the wrongs our fellow men commit against us. The habit of striking back at those who anger us is a weakness which is bound to degrade and work to the detriment of all who practice it. I am convinced that no lesson which my life's experience has taught me has been more costly than the one which I learned by eternally exacting my pound of flesh and feeling it my duty to resent every insult and every injustice. I am thoroughly convinced that one of the greatest lessons a man can learn is that of self-control. One can never exercise any very great amount of influence over others until he first learns to exercise control over himself. It seems to me of particular significance when I stop and consider that most of the world's great leaders were men who were slow to anger, and that the greatest of all the leaders down the ages, who gave us the greatest philosophy the world has ever known, as it is laid down in the Golden Rule, was a man of tolerance and self-control. I never won anything without hard labor and the exercise of my best judgment and careful planning and working long in advance. I had to train myself painfully and laboriously, not merely as regards my body, but as regards my soul and spirit. Theodore Roosevelt. I am convinced that it is a grievous mistake for any person to start out with the belief that upon his shoulders rests the burden of reforming the world or of changing the natural order of human conduct. I believe that nature's own plans are working out quite rapidly enough without the interference of those who would presume to try to rush nature or in any way divert her course. Such presumption leads only to argument, contention, and ill feelings. I have learned, to my own satisfaction at least, that a man who agitates and works up ill feeling between his fellow men for any cause whatsoever serves no real constructive purpose in life. It pays to boost and construct instead of knocking and tearing down. When I began the publication of this magazine, I commenced making use of this principle by devoting my time and editorial pages to that which is constructive and overlooking that which is destructive. Nothing which I have ever undertaken in all of my 36 years has proved as successful or brought me as much real happiness as my work on this little magazine has done. Almost from the very day that the first edition went on the newsstands, success has crowned my efforts in greater abundance than I had ever hoped for. Not necessarily monetary success, but that higher, finer success which is manifested in the happiness which this magazine has helped others to find. I have found, from many years of experience, that it is a sign of weakness if a man permits himself to be influenced against one of his fellow men on account of some remark made by an enemy or someone who is prejudiced. A man cannot truly claim to possess self-control or the ability to think clearly until he learns to form opinions of his fellow men, not from someone else's point of view, but from actual knowledge. One of the most detrimental and destructive habits which I have had to overcome has been that of allowing myself to be influenced against a person by someone who was biased or prejudiced. Another great mistake which I have learned, by having made the same mistake over and over again, is that it is a grievous mistake to slander one's fellow men, either with or without cause. I cannot recall any personal development which I have gained from my mistakes that has given me as much real satisfaction as that which I have experienced from my knowledge that I, to some extent, learned to hold my tongue unless I could say something kind of my fellow men. I only learned to curb this natural human tendency of picking one's enemies to pieces after I began to understand the law of retaliation, through the operation of which a man is sure to reap that which he sows, either by word of mouth or by action. I am by no means master of this evil, but I have at least made a fair start toward conquering it. My experience has taught me that most men are inherently honest, and that those whom we usually call dishonest are victims of circumstances over which they haven't full control. It has been a source of great benefit to me in editing this magazine, to know that it is a natural tendency of people to live up to the reputation which their fellow men give them. I am convinced that every man should go through that biting, though valuable experience, of having been attacked by the newspapers and losing his fortune at least once in his lifetime, because it is when calamity overtakes a man that he learns who his real friends are. The friends stay by the ship, while the would-be's make for cover. I have learned, among other interesting bits of knowledge of human nature, that a man can be very accurately judged by the character of people whom he attracts to him. That old axiomatic phrase, "birds of a feather flock together," is sound philosophy. Throughout the universe, this law of attraction, as it might be called, continuously attracts to certain centers things of a like nature. A great detective once told me that this law of attraction was his chief dependence in hunting down criminals and those charged with breaking the law. I have learned that the man who aspires to be a public servant must be prepared to sacrifice much and withstand abuse and criticism without losing faith in or respect for his fellow men. It is rare indeed to find a man engaged in serving the public whose motives are not questioned by the very people whom his efforts benefit most. The greatest servant the world has ever known not only gained the ill will of many of the people of his time, an ill will to which a great many of the present age have fallen heir, but he lost his life in the bargain. They nailed him to a cross, pierced his side with a spear, and fiendishly tortured him by spitting in his face while his life slowly ebbed away. He set us a mighty fine example to follow in his words, which were something like the following: "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." When I feel my blood rushing to my head in anger on account of the wrongs which my fellow men do me, I find comfort in the fortitude and the patience with which the great philosopher watched his tormentors as they slowly put him to death, for no offense whatsoever except that of trying to help his fellow men find happiness. My experience has taught me that the man who accuses the world of not giving him a chance to succeed in his chosen work, instead of pointing the accusing finger at himself, seldom finds his name in Who's Who. A chance to succeed is something which every man must go out and create for himself. Without a certain degree of combativeness, a person is not apt to accomplish very much in this world, or acquire anything which other people covet very highly. Without combativeness, a man can easily inherit poverty, misery, and failure. But if he gets a grip on the opposite to these, he must be prepared to contend for his rights. But note well that we said his rights. The only rights a man has are those which he creates for himself in return for service rendered. And it may not be a bad idea to remind ourselves that the nature of those rights will correspond exactly to the nature of the service rendered. My experience has taught me that a child can be burdened with no heavier a load or visited with a greater curse than that which accompanies the indiscriminate use of wealth. A close analysis of history will show that most of the great servants of the public and of humanity were people who arose from poverty. In my opinion, a real test of a man is to give him unlimited wealth and see what he will do with it. Wealth which takes away the incentive to engage in constructive, useful work is a curse to those who so use it. It is not poverty that a man needs to watch. It is wealth and the attendant power which wealth creates, for good or for evil ends. I consider it very fortunate that I was born in poverty. While in my more mature years I have associated rather closely with men of wealth, thus I have had a fair demonstration of the effect of these two widely separated positions. I know I shall not need to watch myself so very closely as long as the need for life's ordinary necessities confronts me. But if I should gain great wealth, it would be quite essential for me to see that this did not take away the desire to serve my fellow men. My experience has taught me that a normal person can accomplish anything possible of human accomplishment through the aid of the human mind. The greatest thing which the human mind can do is to imagine. The so-called genius is merely a person who has created something definite in his mind through imagination, and then transformed that picture into reality through bodily action. A man is relieved and gay when he has put his heart into his work and done his best, but what he has said and done otherwise shall give him no peace. Emerson. All this, and a little more, have I learned during these past 36 years. But the greatest thing I have learned is that old truth of which the philosophers all down the ages have told us, that happiness is found not in possession, but in useful service. This is a truth which one can appreciate only after having discovered it for himself. There may be many ways through which I could find greater happiness than that which I receive in return for the work which I devote to the editing of this little magazine, but frankly, I have not discovered it. nor do I expect to. The only thing I can think of which would bring me a greater measure of happiness than I already have would be a larger number of people to serve through the little brown-covered messenger of good cheer and enthusiasm. I believe the happiest moment of my life was experienced a few weeks ago while I was making a small purchase in a store in Dallas, Texas. The young man who was waiting on me was a rather sociable, talkative, thinking type of young fellow. He told me all about what was going on in the store, a sort of behind-the-curtains visit, as it were, and wound up by telling me that his store manager had made all of his people very happy that day by promising them a Golden Rule Psychology Club and a subscription to Hill's Golden Rule magazine, with the store's compliments. No, he didn't know who I was. That interested me, naturally, so I asked him who this Napoleon Hill was, about whom he had been talking. He looked at me with a quizzical expression on his face and replied, "You mean to say you never heard of Napoleon Hill?" I confessed that the name did sound rather familiar, but I asked the young man what it was that caused his store manager to give each of his employees a year's subscription to Hill's Golden Rule, and he said, "Because 1 month's issue of it has converted one of the grouchiest men we've got into one of the best fellows in this store, and my boss said if it would do that, he wanted all of us to read it." It was not the appeal to my egotistical side which made me happy as I shook hands with the young man and told him who I was, but to that deeper emotional side which is always touched in every human being when he finds that his work is bringing happiness to others. This is the sort of happiness which modifies the common human tendency towards selfishness and aids evolution in its work of separating the animal instincts from the human intuition in human beings. I have always contended that a man should develop self-confidence and that he should be a good self-advertisement, and I am going to prove that I practice what I preach on this subject by boldly asserting that if I had an audience as great as that which is served by the Saturday Evening Post, which I could serve monthly through this little magazine, I could accomplish more inside of the next 5 years toward influencing the masses to deal with each other on the Golden Rule basis than all the other newspapers and magazines combined have done in the last 10 years. The enormous newfound power, industrial and political, which the workers have acquired, can be wasted by a reckless use of it in needless stoppages and strikes. If labor is ever to think of itself as a controlling force in the nation, it must cease to think of itself in the terms of class, as it has hitherto. Klein's English labor leader. This, the December issue of the Golden Rule, marks the end of our first year, and I know it will not be construed as an idle boast when I tell my readers that the seeds which we have sown through these pages during these 12 months are beginning to sprout and grow throughout the United States, Canada, and some of the other foreign countries, and that some of the greatest philosophers, teachers, preachers, and businessmen of the age have not only pledged us their hearty moral support, but they have actually gone out and rounded up subscriptions for us in order to help foster the spirit of goodwill which we are preaching. Is it any wonder that your humble editor is happy? There are men who have more, much more, of the worldly wealth to show for their 36 years of experience than the writer has, but I have no fear in challenging all of them to show a greater stock of happiness than I enjoy as a result of my work. Of course, it may be only a meaningless circumstance, but to me, it is quite significant that the greatest and deepest happiness which I have experienced has come to me ever since I began publishing this magazine. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. Yes, it came from the Bible, and it is sound philosophy which always works. And my 30 years of experience has proved conclusively that it does. The first time the notion ever struck me to own and edit a magazine, some 15 years ago, my idea was to jump on everything that was bad and pick to pieces all that I did not like. The gods of fate must have intervened to keep me from starting such an enterprise at that time, because everything that I have learned in my 36 years of experience fully corroborates the philosophy in that previous quotation. You can never become a great leader or a person of influence in the cause of justice until you have developed great self-control. Before you can be of great service to your fellow men in any capacity, you must master the common human tendency of anger, intolerance, and cynicism. When you permit another person to make you angry, you are allowing that person to dominate you and drag you down to his level. To develop self-control, you must make liberal and systematic use of the Golden Rule philosophy. You must acquire the habit of forgiving those who annoy and arouse you to anger. Intolerance and selfishness make very poor bedfellows for self-control. These qualities always clash when you try to house them together. One or the other must get out. The first thing the shrewd lawyer usually does when he starts to cross-examine a witness is to make the witness angry and thereby cause him to lose his self-control. Anger is a state of insanity. The well-balanced person is a person who is slow to anger and who always remains cool and calculating in his procedure. He remains calm and deliberate under all conditions. Such a person can succeed in all legitimate undertakings. To master conditions, you must first master the self. A person who exercises great self-control never slanders his neighbor. His tendency is to build up and not to tear down. Are you a person of self-control? If not, why do you not develop this great virtue? Chapter 8. Habit of performing more work than paid for, from poverty to wealth through struggle. The 8th billboard on the road to success is the habit of performing more work than paid for. The story of Edwin C. Barnes, who rode into East Orange, New Jersey on a freight car less than 15 years ago, secured a job from Thomas A. Edison, and is now retiring with all the money he needs at the age of 40. This is another story of success that grew out of struggle, plus the application of those fundamentals of which we are writing in the pages of this magazine every month. The editor of this magazine knows Edwin C. Barnes intimately and is qualified, therefore, to write authentically concerning those qualities through which Mr. Barnes has